Hello, Leo. How are you today?
I'm doing terrific, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I'm with Leo Bottary and
It's Leo Bottary.
Leo Bottary. Thank you, Leo.
Sorry.
Um, do you mind if we start over?
No, please,
Those things
just start right over. Sorry about that. I figured you'd want to get that. So,
I do want to get it.
yeah.
All right. Hello, Leo. Welcome.
Great to see you, Scott. Thanks for having me today.
You bet. I'm here with Leo Bottary, and we are going to talk about peer groups today. And I know, Leo, you've written 3 books. I've only had the pleasure of reading one of your books, so I've got a little homework to do. But one book that I did read, The Power of Peers, it was a fantastic read. And I was really fascinated about your research, what you found. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about that book and your other 2 books.
Sure. Well, The Power of Peers was kind of an interesting story behind that. I was at Vistage at the time, leading a rebranding effort in early 2013. And I'm going around the country and I'm talking to CEOs and I'm asking them, how do you learn? How do you grow? How do you bring new thinking into your company? And to a person, they said, I read books, I have a coach, I hire consultants, I go to events and conferences, I watch TED Talks, you name it. But nobody was suggesting that peer groups was even in their consideration set. So I had to report out to the board of directors on the status of the brand rollout. But while I was doing so, I shared with them this experience that I was having in the field and saying basically that, when you think about the number of people that could be in a group and the number of people that are, and the fact that no one is really thinking about it or has it top of mind here, I feel like even though we've been doing this since 1957, there are groups all over the world that have been doing this for decades. Every one of us is trying to sell a Mercedes to someone who doesn't even know what a car is. So I basically said, look, wouldn't it be terrific, rather than write a hardcover brochure about Vistage, essentially, right, about how great we are and our groups and all this other stuff, I said, why don't we step back and take a true thought leadership position and look at the entire category? And we did. And we worked very collaboratively with YPO and EO and Renaissance Executive Forums, now called REF, a whole host of organizations around the world. And what we did was we looked at high-performing peer groups, which kind of begs the question, well, what does that mean? What's a high-performing peer group look like versus anything else? We actually relied on the organizations themselves, obviously including Vistage and the others, to identify for us what are the highest performing peer groups they have. And everybody measured it in kind of a different way. Some used net promoter score. Some used compound annual growth rate for members over a period of years. There was retention data, survey data, all kinds of things, and sometimes a combination of thereof. But we ended up attending meetings and interviewing members, and it was rather extraordinary in terms of what we learned. So we were able to put together a book called The Power of Peers, How the Company You Keep Drives Leadership, Growth, and Success, which provides a narrative for anybody who's thinking about leading a group, starting a group, being a member of a group, whatever that means. At least they understand what the value proposition is all about. If it's right for them, great. And if it isn't, that's okay too. But at least now they know what it is and they can consider doing it.
Well, that's great. I know you did a lot of research for that book. What were some of the interesting findings that stood out to you in your journey of researching?
So there were a few things. Again, when we were looking at high-performing peer groups, we started consistently seeing 2 things. One is that high-performing peer groups had what we identified as a robust learning achieving cycle. So the idea is that it's learning, sharing, applying, achieving. And by the way, since that time, we've added celebrating, and I'll explain that in just a moment, because obviously now I've done over 500 workshops with groups and teams and all of that. So you learn a few things along the way since we did this at the beginning. But what we know is we learn better when we learn together. When we are in a situation where rather than read it ourselves, or read it a second time, if we actually share content with one another, we understand it more deeply and we will retain it longer. And the thing about groups, though, is they're not book clubs, right? It's not like you take in content, you understand it better, and that's all well and good. these members also gave each other the confidence, the courage, and the encouragement to apply things they've learned. And it was remarkable that even when there may have been some trial and error there, once they started achieving something from what they learned, and then celebrating that win, which is really, really key, now it drives that reinforcing loop. So that's one thing that we identified that high-performing groups do particularly well. The second piece, which we didn't pay nearly enough attention to, I will admit, in the first book, The Power of Peers, but it's this idea of intentional and collateral learning. When we learn together in groups or teams, we not only experience intentional learning, which may be a speaker visiting our group, talking about sales, finance, or culture, whatever it may happen to be, thinking about that content, digesting it, and either doing something with it or not in that intentional way, or when you think about how groups process issues, how they work on challenges or opportunities together, oftentimes in kind of the executive session part of what they do, regardless of who's running the groups. And when you think about it that way, the collateral learning becomes what you learn from how you learn. So as you're working through these things together, you have to be more present. You become a better listener. You ask more precise questions. You don't make assumptions and jump to conclusions and rush to judgment on things. As you build muscles around those things, it not only makes you a more effective group member, but in the case of CEO peer advisory groups, for example, they now start modeling those behaviors in their companies. And by the way, that becomes something that is contagious with their senior leadership team over time. So it's very, very powerful in terms of what that looks like and how it works. So those were two things. Now, I will add one other piece here, and that is that none of those two things happen by putting a bunch of people in a room and just kind of hoping for the best. So this is where having the right people in the room and really defining that and having groups define for themselves what that looks like. Having those members enjoy psychological safety, the ability to be open and vulnerable with one another, oftentimes fueled very much so by the fact that it's a confidential setting. You know, what happens in the room, however they convene, room, Zoom, whatever it is, stays there. They tended to do a great job of leveraging all the intellectual and emotional capital in the room. So this comes down to productivity, right? How do we really tap into all of this talent that we have around this table? Accountability became a big one. Now, initially, when we were looking at accountability, we looked at it from the perspective of the member to whoever was leading the group. It became evident pretty quickly that it was accountability among the members that actually was the most important. So as we began to study those relationships and see how that works, accountability referring to not only someone accepting personal responsibility for bringing their best to every meeting with the expectation that others will do the same, but that they follow up and follow through with one another, not only from an accountability standpoint, but because it's a learning opportunity lost every time we don't follow through. You know, as you all know, you can sit in a meeting and everyone comes up with these genius ideas around a conference room table. Now you leave that meeting, that plan hits real life and it might deal you a little something different. So you want to make sure that you're bringing those learnings back to the group. And last but not least, when we looked at leaders of groups, and interestingly enough, as I mentioned, because we looked at so many different kinds of groups and the models were so different, you know, some groups are run by chairs, some were run by members that had facilitation training, others may be run by whoever was hosting the meeting that month. We found, though, I think over time that what made the leader effective and what the responsibility of the leader was essentially the same. One, that we found the most effective leader being a servant leader, that someone who leads those groups does so not for their own self-aggrandizement or to pad their resume or anything like that. They do it because they truly care about helping the people in the room achieve whatever aspirations or meet any challenge that they may have. Second was, we felt and saw time and time again that a leader of a group who saw themselves as a part of the group versus a part from the group was very, very important. It allowed them to model those behaviors. It allowed them to be and lead something where everyone had a stake in the outcome and they had shared responsibility for it. They're all on the same side of the table, not on different sides, right? And last but not least, even though the leader of the group was a part of the group, not apart from it, that doesn't mean that there weren't very specific responsibilities. For example, they became the steward of the other four factors. They make sure we get all the right people in the room exhibiting those behaviors that we all agreed upon are so important, that we not only enjoy an environment of psychological safety, but everyone is using it to the best of their ability for themselves and for others, that we're as productive as we can be, and that we enjoy a culture of accountability that's healthy and one that serves the group, not one that feels onerous, makes you feel like you're playing defense, but one that truly serves the group. So in a nutshell, that gives you a sense of what the Power of Peers was all about. Now, of course, since that time, again, there's been some evolution of the models, as you might imagine. Peer Innovation, which is my latest book, looks specifically at three things. One, how the models evolved. Secondly, what were the prevailing challenges that groups experienced time and time again, as we looked at them. And then also how to take what peer advisory groups have been doing so brilliantly for decades and how to bring those principles into the team in your organization.
And I think you mentioned something about celebration somewhere along the way.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about that.
It's a big one. And I will tell you that initially, the idea was that thought really kind of bundled celebration in with the achieving stage of the learning achieving cycle, until it became evident over, again, hundreds of workshops and working with so many groups and companies, that people don't celebrate nearly often enough. And what I mean by celebrating is not necessarily, although this is important, it's not about birthdays and anniversaries and things like that. It's about celebrating those small wins. It's about keeping people inspired in your organization, especially when it comes to achieving longer term goals. One of the metaphors that I tend to use for this is my daughters and I took them to climb their first mountain peak in Colorado. And if you've ever done this, it's difficult, right? This was a 12,800 foot peak. So we get up over the tree line, and what starts to happen, right? Climb gets steeper, the air gets thinner. Here we are. And the girls start looking at me like, hey, Dad, the view looks pretty good from here. Or, hey, there's a puff of white cloud up there. Is that weather? And we need to be weird about that? I said, no, I think we're all right. Of course, I'm not taking the hint, right? Finally, they said, look, this has been great, but I think we're kind of done here. By the way, every time we stare at that peak, it never seems to be getting any closer. And of course, they found that pretty discouraging, as you might imagine, right? Because you're putting all this physical effort in, you're climbing, the next thing you know, you just feel like you're going nowhere. So I asked them, I said, look, if you give me another 10 minutes or so here, and it was exactly 10 minutes, believe me, because when it hit the 10 minutes, they were ready to stop. But before we left, I said, let's mark where we are. And there happened to be this big rock and there's this bush, kind of growing out of it. We climbed for another 10 minutes. They said, okay, 10 minutes, we're done. Because I told them, if they're done, no questions asked, we can go down off the mountain. And they said, yeah, I think we're done. And they immediately pointed to the peak and said, you know what? See, didn't get any closer than it was 10 minutes ago. And I said, look behind you. And what they did was they saw that bush and it looked like the tiniest dot on the landscape. They couldn't believe how far they went in 10 minutes. Now, all of a sudden, it changes everything. Right? Instead of lamenting over how far we still have to go, we start celebrating our progress. We start saying, hey, 10 minutes ago we were there. Now we're here. Let's go another 10 minutes. Let's go another 15. They both summited that day. I don't think this is a lot different from what we face all the time in our companies when people talk about keeping your eye on the prize, which I think is some of the worst advice could ever be given to anybody. Keep your goal in mind, sure. Don't be keeping your eye on the prize. Focus on your progress. Focus on the fact that getting to the top of that mountain is going to be one step at a time. You are not going to cheat that process, but you're going to celebrate that progress each and every time along the way. And there's many other examples of this too, in terms of the importance and the power of celebrating small wins. And I think if people get good at it and get creative about it, they'll get those big wins far more often.
Well, those are great words of advice to keep people looking at just increments and moving forward and how proud they should be of where they've advanced the ball and gone from there. Leo, let me change topics for a moment. You studied various types of groups along the way. What different types of groups or organizations did you study, and how could you compare and contrast some of the groups that you studied?
People do things in different ways. Some have smaller groups, some have larger groups, some meet more frequently, some meet less frequency for a longer time, a shorter time. And I'm not going to sit and suggest that there's any one particular way that works better in some kind of, global way, right? I think what it comes down to who are the people you're sitting next to? What is their commitment to one another? And how transparent can you be? What kind of clarity can you create with the leader of the group and with everyone else about what you're looking to achieve, so that everyone knows how to help you, and who to look for help, because you're going to understand their strengths and their aspirations and all of that. So I think whether the group is 8 or 18, whether it's virtual or in person or however, I think it's finding the group that's right for you. That was really the spirit of the Power of Peers. It was not designed to steer anyone toward a particular organization or particular company. We wanted to, I think, identify and frame what the group experience could be. Even when I do assessments or aspirational exercises with groups today, and as you know, I've done hundreds of them, I'm not there to assess anything. I'm there to provide frameworks for people to create what they want for themselves and what's going to work best for the people in the room. And I think that's really ultimately, I think any leader of any group like this is really going to listen to the members, and they're really going to get a sense of they're going to obviously provide them with resources and tools and ways to leverage a group experience they would never otherwise might be acquainted with on their own. But by the same token, I think there's a lot of really good groups out there. And my recommendation is that if you're not part of a group, it's really worth a try. It's really worth thinking about what that might look like, because I think today's world is moving too fast. It's too complex. The change is happening again so quickly. And when you get people around a room who can have open, honest dialogue with one another, deep dialogue with one another, and talk about real things, what they're concerned about, what they're afraid of, to be able to sit in a room, for example, if you're a CEO and you have someone who understands exactly what it's like to sit in your chair, to have all of that responsibility and not the luxury of looking at life through HR, marketing, legal, or whatever. They got to look at the whole shooting match, right? And to recognize that there are various sectors of the economy sitting around that table that all too often can provide early warning signs for things to come. And I think any time we can get a sense of what's around the corner, I think that's hugely helpful. And it's kind of like it's your own version of the Weather Channel, that you get. You don't have to. I think from being in Georgia, and I live in Florida too, where anyone who's going to depend on looking out the window to prepare for a hurricane in time is going to be in a lot of trouble. So we need to pay attention. We need to stick our head up out of our company, talk to people in various industries, and work together toward leading better companies. And I think there's so much at stake: our employees, our families, our communities, all of that. And so we can help one another a great deal, and the groups are remarkably successful at it.
Good. Well, Leo, this is great information. I know you're an author of 3 books, and I think we've talked about 2 of them. What was the third one?
So the third one was the middle book. The middle book is called What Anyone Can Do. So what it did was it actually stepped outside the arena of formal peer groups, talked a little bit about them, but it basically said, and by the way, where the title comes from, What Anyone Can Do, is a line in a book written by Joe Henderson, former editor of Runner's World, who in 1976 wrote a book called The Long Run Solution. And in it, he was describing successful runners, successful people in general. And he basically said, most of these folks aren't capable of superhuman feats. They don't leap tall buildings in a single bound. They just do the things that anyone can do far more often, right? Because left to our own devices, that's why New Year's resolutions have a 92% failure rate, because we're all excited on New Year's Eve. Okay, yeah, starting tomorrow, boy, we're going to go on that diet. We're going to do this. We're going to save money. We're going to do, and we're like, forget it. If we enlist and engage the support of others, it can make a big difference. And what Anyone Can Do is actually a compilation of 50 interviews that I did in a podcast called The Year of the Peer. And I called it that basically so I'd have an exit strategy from podcasting pretty much at the time, because I wasn't sure, how long I wanted to do it or whatever. But incredible wisdom from these folks. I asked every one of them, did you become successful all by yourself? And they said, of course not. It's ridiculous. Countless people that have helped me, which is why they not only try to thank the people who helped them all the time, but, some of those folks they can't thank, anymore. So the desire to pay it forward, the pull to pay it forward to others becomes huge. And I think knowing that there are people out there that, if you're at some point in your career and you're looking for 15 minutes of somebody's advice or thoughts or experiences about how they got where they got, they'll talk to you more often than not. And it's definitely worth doing that. But yeah, I wanted to explore that part of it, because not everyone is going to be part of a formal peer group necessary, but we can do a better job of enlisting and engaging the support of the people closest to us.
Yeah. All right, Leo, that's great. I think we're running out of time here, but I know people after watching this are going to want to get a hold of you and learn more. How do people connect with you?
So you can certainly connect with me through LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so you can go to Leo Bottary, LeoBottary. There's leobottary.com, the website, a ton of content there. There's literally hundreds of articles and just all kinds of free content for anyone who wants it. I think there's a good explanation of the value proposition. And if it's something that anyone is interested in doing, either with their teams or creating groups to work alongside their teams, which I do quite a bit of that as well. Yeah, let me know.
Very good. Leo, again, thank you so much for the time. And I look forward to reading the next book that you've got out. And I know you're speaking, and hopefully I'll catch you at one of the conferences.
Hey, thank you very much.
All right. All the best.